600 hours, February 18, 1945. The waters off Iwo Jima churned like boiling tar beneath the grey Pacific dawn. The thunder of naval guns rolled over the horizon, each salvo shaking the sea with the promise of invasion. Thick smoke hung low, obscuring the black volcanic island ahead. Inside one of the small Higgins landing craft, a boy sat hunched over his rifle, his knuckles white, his heart pounding faster than the twin engines beneath him. He wasn't yet 18. His name was Donald Kunkel, Seaman First Class, United States Navy. He was about to step into hell. U.S. Navy Action Report, Feb 1945. All night, the fleet had hurled steel at the island. Battleships like the USS Tennessee and USS Nevada unleashed their 16-inch guns, lighting the horizon in orange flashes. The air stank of cordite, oil, and fear. Somewhere in that chaos, Don Kunkel whispered a prayer, not for victory, not even for courage, but for survival. He had made a promise to himself, one he could not explain, one that lived in silence between every heartbeat. Decklog, USS Dickens, 1945. At 0700 the order came. Landing waves, prepare to move in. The coxswain shouted above the roar of the engines as spray drenched their faces. The grey surf grew darker as the landing craft neared the volcanic sand. Ahead, Iwo Jima was nothing but a jagged nightmare, smoke columns twisting like black fingers into the sky. The Marines would storm the beaches first, but the Navy transport crews like Don's were close behind, bringing ammunition, food, and men into the inferno. 5th Fleet After Action Report, 1945. When the first shell struck the water near his craft, Don saw the ocean rise up in a white wall. Shrapnel tore across the surface. He ducked instinctively, hearing the metallic ping of fragments hitting the boat's hull. The men around him went silent, too scared even to curse. They had heard the stories. The Japanese guns were still alive. They were waiting. Battle of Iwo Jima, Oral Histories, 1946. 3 weeks earlier, Don had been in training at Great Lakes, still just a boy with dreams of seeing the world. He had lied about his age to enlist, barely 17. In his first days, they wouldn't even let him train. Too young, the petty officer barked. Wait 2 days, sailor, then you'll belong to the Navy. He spent those 2 days pacing the barracks, staring out across the frozen field, wondering what war would really be like. Recruit Training Command Records, Jan 1945. It didn't take long to find out. The USS Dickens, an attack transport vessel of the Haskell class, carried over 1,500 troops and crew. Built in California's Kaiser shipyards, the same industrial. Miracle that turned out a new Liberty ship every 10 days. The Dickens was fast, reliable, and armed with enough guns to defend herself against aircraft. But she was no battleship. Her real weapon was her men, the sailors who ferried Marines and supplies to shore under fire. Don was one of them, assigned to a landing craft known as a Duck. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945, on the night before. The invasion. As the fleet's guns thundered, Don lay awake in his bunk. The air was heavy with diesel fumes and the constant vibration of engines. He stared at the steel ceiling above him, eyes wide, every explosion outside rattling the thin metal walls. That's when it happened. In the silence between salvos, he saw, or thought he saw, a light. A figure, a voice soft but sure, telling him he would be all right, that there were plans for him. Don't take any chances, it said. Personal diary entry, Feb 1945. He would remember that voice for the rest of his life. At dawn, the sea turned red. Don's boat rocked violently as explosions tore through the surf. One of the landing craft ahead was hit directly, disappearing in a burst of flame and spray. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but debris and silence. I was scared to death, Don would later say. But I made it. U.S. Naval Historical Interview, 1983. When his turn came, Don's Duck slid forward through the waves, its engine groaning under the strain. The cargo net dropped from the Dickens deck, and the sailors began loading crates, heavy boxes marked M67 grenades. Don stared at the stenciled letters and felt his stomach drop. One hit, and their boat would vanish into the sea. Ordnance loading log, USS Dickens, 1945. As they neared the shore, the illusion of safety vanished. Japanese artillery opened up from hidden bunkers carved into the cliffs. Machine gun fire raked the waves, bullets cutting tiny fountains into the sea around them. The men ducked low, gripping their helmets. Don could see Marines already lying lifeless on the beach, their bodies dark against the pale sand. He tried not to look. U.S. Marine Corps Combat Film Unit, Feb 1945. For 3 days, he made run after run to the shore, each one a gamble between life and death. On one trip, another landing craft beside him took a direct hit. The explosion shredded everything within it. When the smoke cleared, the officer ordered Don to search for dog tags. He climbed aboard what remained of the craft and froze. There were no men, only fragments. He turned and stumbled back, eyes hollow. "If you want dog tags," he said quietly, "you go in and get them." Eyewitness interview 1946. That night he couldn't sleep. The sounds of battle echoed in his mind, the screams, the shells, the roar of engines. The smell of burned oil clung to his clothes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces, boys like him, gone in an instant. Combat Stress Memo, Navy Medical Corps, 1945. By the third day, the beaches of Iwo Jima were carpeted with the dead. The black volcanic sand was soaked with blood and fuel. Don's boat kept moving, hauling more men, more supplies, into the storm. He was no longer a boy. War had aged him years in days. Pacific Theater Burial Report, 1945. When the call came to pull back, he sat in silence, staring at the waves. The island still burned behind him, Mount Suribachi rising like a black tomb against the sky. Somewhere amid that smoke, Marines were fighting hand-to-hand, inch by inch, for every foot of ground. He would never forget what he saw and what he couldn't save. After Action Summary, 5th Amphibious Force, 1945. Later, when his ship moved toward Okinawa, Don watched from the deck as a Japanese suicide plane dived toward a nearby LST. The explosion lit up the sea. The shockwave hit the Dickens seconds later, knocking men to the deck. "That's when I realized," he recalled years later, "that war wasn't just terrible, it was endless." Aviation Combat Report, April 1945. But amid that endlessness, something inside him shifted. The voice he had heard, the promise that he would live for a reason, haunted him. Perhaps it was madness born of fear. Perhaps it was something else. Whatever it was, it stayed with him. It whispered that he was meant for more than survival. Chaplain's Log, USS Dickens, 1945. As the Dickens turned south toward the Philippines, Don stood at the railing, the Pacific wind cutting cold against his face. Behind him, Iwo Jima faded into the mist, a graveyard of heroes, a monument to youth lost too soon. Ahead lay another chapter of war, and with it the chance to keep that unspoken promise, the one he didn't yet understand, the one that would define the rest of his life. The sea was calmer now, though the horizon still carried the smell of war. The USS Dickens steamed toward the Philippines under a bruised sky, her decks lined with sailors trying to wash away the memories of Iwo Jima. But for Seaman First Class Donald Kunkel, the noise never stopped. Every splash of a wave sounded like shellfire, every shadow like smoke. He didn't yet know it, but the unspoken promise made on that black sand beach was about to find its meaning, not in glory, but in mercy. U.S. Navy Medical Corps Field Interview, May 1945. The Dickens was one of nearly 400 Haskell-class attack. Transports built in less than 2 years, an industrial miracle that only the United States could have summoned. Each carried its own complement of Higgins landing craft, radar arrays, and anti-aircraft batteries. The ship's heart was its crew, 56 officers, and more than 480 enlisted men, many younger than 20. They lived in steel corridors that echoed, with the constant hum of engines and the scent of salt and fuel. The engineering spaces, designed by the men of Kaiser Shipyards and the Bureau of Ships, could drive the 14,000-ton vessel at 17 knots, carrying men and munitions across oceans. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945. When the Dickens reached Leyte Gulf, she joined a scattered fleet of transports ferrying food, ammunition, and people between the Philippine Islands. The great invasion of Japan still loomed ahead, but the fighting here had turned into something quieter, stranger, a ghost war. Small groups of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, living in caves and jungles, emerging by night to raid villages. The Navy called them stragglers. The locals called them nightmares. U.S. Pacific Fleet Intelligence Brief, June 1945. Don's duties changed from combat landings to humanitarian runs, ferrying civilians from one island to another under the watch of armed Marines. He helped load women and children onto the ship, their eyes hollow from years of occupation. For a boy who had seen death in every form, the sound of children's laughter on deck was like hearing a forgotten language. We'd give them food, blankets, anything we had, he later said. It was the first time in months I saw somebody smile. Oral History Transcript, 1987. Then came the day that tested him in a way no shell ever could. The ship was anchored near Mindoro, the tropical air heavy and still. A group of evacuees came aboard, among them a pregnant woman in labor. Don was helping her up from the dock when she collapsed on the hot steel deck. The temperature that day reached 112 degrees. There was no doctor on deck, no medic nearby. The baby was coming. Ship's log, USS Dickens, July 1945. For a moment, everything around him disappeared. No orders, no guns, just the sound of her breathing and the shimmer of heat rising off the deck. He remembered the voice, the same one from Iwo Jima, telling him he would be needed. Now he understood. Kneeling beside her, barely 18 years old, he caught the child as it entered the world. He used his own knife to cut the umbilical cord after a crewman tied it off with a scrap of cloth. The newborn cried once, strong and clear, and the men around him cheered. Sick bay report, USS Dickens, July 1945. A few days later, the woman asked to see him. Don walked into sick bay, his uniform still stained with salt. She handed him the baby, a boy, tiny and perfect. She said his name would be Donald. For the first time since the war began, the young sailor smiled without guilt. Ship's personnel memo, July 1945. Life aboard ship settled into a strange calm. They ran supply missions between Samar, Leyte, and Luzon. At night, sailors played cards under red lights, their laughter carrying across the deck like a song from home. But beyond the perimeter of light, the jungle still whispered. Snipers fired from unseen ridges. Now and then a boat would vanish during a run. The war refused to die. Naval Operations Summary, August 1945. One night, the Dickens anchored near a small island to evacuate civilians. Don volunteered for shore detail. He stepped into the humid dark, the sound of cicadas filling the air. The village smelled of smoke and fear. The Marines were rounding up families to board the ship. That's when he saw her, a young woman with dark hair and eyes too deep for words. Her name was Lestrina. She thanked him in halting English, her voice trembling as she handed him a bowl of rice. Don smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to salute or bow. Crew interview, 1946. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again. Don would visit the village church on Sundays, drawn by the faint sound of a hymn echoing through the palms. Lestrina's family would invite him to dinner, serving fish and fruit while they talked about Ohio, snow, and life after the war. If you stay, her father told him one night, you'll never need to work again. You'll have a home and you'll have her. Field Notes, Chaplain's Office, Org 1945. Don didn't know what to say. For the first time since he'd enlisted, he felt peace. No gunfire, no orders, just laughter, and the faint smell of coconut oil in the air. He began to imagine staying, to imagine a life beyond the Navy, a life built on something simple and good. Personal letter draft, Org 1945, then came the ring. It was small, silver, imperfect, the kind of gift born from love, not wealth. She gave it to him on a Saturday night beneath a flickering lantern. "Come for dinner tomorrow," she said softly. He promised he would. That night he polished the ring until it gleamed. Crewmate testimony, 1946. The next morning he climbed the hill to her house. A crowd had gathered outside. Her father met him at the door, his hands trembling. Don knew before the words came. The Japanese stragglers had come down from the hills in the night. They had found the family. They had done what desperation always does when hope is gone. Lestrina was gone. Naval Police Report, Org 1945. He stepped inside. She lay on the dining table, covered in a white gown. Her father unbuttoned the fabric and showed him the wound, a bayonet slash across her chest. They killed her after the man couldn't finish. Don didn't move. The world tilted. The ring on his finger felt heavier than steel. U.S. Navy Field Investigation, 1945. That night, Don stood on the beach and looked out at the dark Pacific. The sky was full of stars, the same stars that had watched him at Iwo Jima. He took the ring from his pocket, kissed it once, and closed his fist around it. Somewhere behind him, a Marine played a harmonica, the slow, broken notes drifting into the surf. The promise returned, not in words, but in the quiet certainty that he would carry her memory always. U.S. Chaplain Corps Interview, 1946. When news came of the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender, the Dickens erupted in celebration. Men shouted, fired flares sang until their voices cracked. Don stood apart, leaning against the rail. Victory felt hollow. He had survived everything the enemy could throw, shells, fire, even fate. Yet the price was carved into his heart. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The war was over. The boy who had gone to sea at 16 was coming home. But the voice that once promised he would live for a reason still echoed, waiting to reveal what that reason would be. And the next chapter of his life, the hardest mission of all, was about to begin. The war had ended. But for Donald Kunkel, peace did not come with silence. It came with responsibility. The guns had fallen quiet, yet the echo of the Pacific still followed him home, a phantom weight of memories that clung to his heart. When he stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco, the cheers of victory felt distant, hollow. The sailor who had once feared death now feared something greater, forgetting what those years had meant. U.S. Navy Discharge Record, Sept. 1945. The American mainland was alive with celebration. Parades rolled through every city. Flags waved. Bands played Anchors Aweigh. But behind the crowds were faces just like his, young men who had seen too much. Don returned to Ohio with a duffel bag, a few photographs, and a ring he never took off. His parents barely recognized him. The boy who had left to fight had returned a man carved by duty and loss. Homefront News Archive, 1945. At night, he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the crash of shells that no longer existed. Doctors called it battle fatigue. The Navy called it nerves. Don didn't have words for it. Instead, he worked, long hours in the local steel mill, surrounded by the same clang of metal and heat that had filled the decks of the Dickens. He married, raised a family, and built the quiet life he had dreamed of while staring into the waves. But inside him a promise stirred, something he had never spoken aloud. Veterans Administration Case File, 1947. He carried the voice of that night at Iwo Jima with him always. "They have plans for you," it had said. In the years that followed, he wondered what those plans were. Decades passed. America changed, from ration books to television, from the Pacific War to the Cold War. Don watched his children grow, his country rebuild, and his memories fade at the edges like old film reels. He had survived history, but history had also shaped him. U.S. Veterans Oral History Project, 1985. Then in 1992, the voice's meaning returned, quiet, inevitable, and divine. Her name was Louise. She was kind, sharp-witted, and carried her own scars from life's battles. They met at a church supper, and from the start Don felt something he hadn't in years, peace without guilt. They married, both knowing they were not young anymore but determined to make the years ahead count. For Don, it was a second chance at a promise he had long forgotten. Personal Correspondence, 1992. Their early years were simple and happy. Gardening, Sunday drives, coffee at dawn while the radio murmured old swing songs. But time like war strikes without warning. One morning Louise collapsed, a stroke. The doctors said she would never walk again, would need full-time care. The old sailor listened quietly, nodding. When the doctor asked if he wanted to discuss options, Don simply said, "No, I'll take care of her myself." Ohio Hospital Records, 1994. And he did. For years, every morning before sunrise, he would help her dress, make her breakfast, and sit beside her as she smiled faintly, her words slow but grateful. When the nights grew long, he would sit at her bedside reading from the Bible, his hand resting over hers. "She was a wonderful lady," he would say later. "And I took good care of her." Veterans Interview, 2001. Neighbors called it devotion. Don called it duty. To him, it was no different than standing his post on deck under fire. Only now the battlefield was his home, the enemy time itself. He fixed her meals with the precision of a quartermaster, cleaned her room like a deckhand scrubbing steel. "This is what the angel meant," he would whisper when exhaustion came. These were the plans. Personal Reflection 2002. As the years passed, his own body weakened. Arthritis bent his fingers. His hearing faded. But he refused to stop. The same strength that had driven him through the black sands of Iwo Jima now fueled him through sleepless nights at Louise's side. When she smiled, the decades fell away. When she wept, he remembered the boy on the Dickens, terrified yet certain he would live for a reason. Elder Care Transcript 2005. After she passed, Don sat alone in their house, the silence almost unbearable. He would sit by the window in the evenings, the sunlight dimming against framed photos of their life, his navy portrait beside hers from their wedding day. Sometimes he would speak aloud to the empty room, half believing she could hear him. "You were my orders," he'd say, "and I followed them." Family Interview 2010. War had taught him that promises are not made in words but in deeds. His unspoken promise, born in fear, tested in love, had carried him across a century. In her illness he found purpose. In her care, redemption. The horrors of Iwo Jima and the pain of Lestrina's death no longer haunted him. They had led him here. To understand that survival is not enough, one must live for something greater. U.S. Strategic Psychological Report 1946. Across the world, historians wrote about the great battles, the tanks, the fleets, the strategies. But men like Don Kunkel carried the true weight of victory, the burden of memory, the duty to turn pain into compassion. He was not a general or a hero carved in marble. He was a sailor who saw too much and chose in the aftermath to serve life instead of death. Smithsonian Veterans Collection 2015. In his later years, local schools would invite him to speak about the war. He would begin the same way every time. "War is terrible, it is. I saw things a kid shouldn't see." The room would fall silent. Then he'd tell them about the baby born on the hot deck of the Dickens, about the ring he still kept, and about the voice that promised he would live for a reason. He would never mention the angel outright. "Some things," he'd say, "are just between a man and God." High School Veterans Assembly Recording 2017. When asked what he was proudest of, he didn't mention medals or campaigns. He would smile and say, "I kept my word." Family Interview 2018. As the twilight of his life approached, Don's story became less about war and more about endurance, the invisible courage of the ordinary. His shipmates were gone, his family grown, but his spirit remained steady, anchored by that same promise whispered across a lifetime. When visitors asked if he ever saw that angel again, he'd look out the window and answer softly, "Every time she smiled." Memoirs, Project Transcript 2020. History records the battles. But the true victories, the ones that shape generations, happen in the quiet moments afterward. In a kitchen where a veteran makes breakfast for his wife, in a memory that outlives fear. Donald Kunkel's war began in the smoke of Iwo Jima, but his greatest campaign was fought in the silence of love and loyalty. U.S. Naval Heritage Report 2021. In the end, he fulfilled the prophecy whispered to him amid the thunder of guns, that he would live to serve, not to fight, to heal, not to destroy. His life became a testament to the forgotten soldiers who carried peace home on their shoulders and never set it down again. As he once said, voice trembling but sure, "I had a guardian angel. She told me they had plans for me." And they did. In the flickering light of memory, the young sailor stands once more on the deck of the Dickens, the Pacific wind in his hair, the promise alive in his heart, unspoken, unbroken, eternal.